You know what? I want to play all the Zelda games, so I'm gonna do that. The Zelda series is probably my favorite video game series out there. While there are certain individual games that I like more than any one Zelda game, when we're talking about, like, the series overall as a whole and every game that it contains, it's really tough to compete with Zelda, because there's like 30 or something of these games, and almost every single one of them is excellent. The only other series that has a track record that good off the top of my head would be Kirby, which I also like, but I've always been particularly a big fan of the Zelda games. As a kid, I just played them to death, and I've always loved them, and I still love them to this day. But, despite my love for the series, there are numerous Zelda games that I have yet to actually play, and believe it or not, Zelda 1 is one of those games. I've never played through Zelda 1. I've touched it here and there a couple of times, but every time I've tried to play this game, I just bounced off of it super duper hard. But being primitive is not the reason I've never been able to get into Zelda 1 before, because I got my start playing really old school games, so I have no issue with stuff like that. The problem for me with Zelda 1 has always been the exact same problem I have with Metroid 1, which is the lack of direction that the game gives you. The game just starts, and it's just go, beat the game now, and you have nothing to go off of, and, you know, that's okay for a lot of games. I do like games that are more open, and they don't handhold you everywhere and tell you exactly where to go. I enjoy that as well. But you gotta give me something to work with, and the original Zelda and the original Metroid, they give you nothing. And so every time I've tried to play Zelda 1, it's always resulted in me just wandering around, having no idea what I'm supposed to be doing or where I'm supposed to be going, until I eventually just stop playing. I haven't really watched very much of Zelda 1, so I haven't, like, learned the game through osmosis or anything. I don't really know that much about it. And so, this is probably going to sound ridiculous to people that are very familiar with this game, but, like, I didn't even know where the first dungeon was, and so I just would walk around aimlessly for who knows how long, and I hated it, and I had that same problem in Metroid 1, where you're just walking around, going somewhere, hoping that you stumble into the thing you're supposed to do next. That degree of openness to me really starts to feel like aimless, just wandering, and it kinda just sucks, and it really gets on my nerves. But I've always wanted to try giving the game a go, as, you know, it's a very historically important game. I've just never really been able to get into it. But then I decided to investigate the ROM hack scene for Zelda 1, what's out there, and what I found is what I'm playing here, Zelda Redux, which is a ROM hack of Zelda 1 that makes various changes and improvements and refinements to the game. Most important of which is that it gives you a goddamn world map in the top right corner of the screen, instead of a completely worthless gray box like the normal game. Suddenly now, my aimless wandering actually could be compartmentalized in my head because I could see where I've been on the map and understand the geography and the relation of where everything is connected to each other. And then with that, I was actually able to pinpoint areas of interest and where I have been, where I haven't been, where I can go, where I can't go. And while I did still have a good amount of wandering around having no idea where the first dungeon is, eventually, through process of elimination, I was able to find it. And sure, if I just kept playing normal Zelda 1, eventually I would have found it as well, but without a map, my sense of geography is just non-existent. I have no idea where I am relative to anything else, so just having that map there, wow, does it make the biggest difference in the world for me. I mean, I guess, yeah, I could have just looked up the locations of all the dungeons and stuff before, but then you're not even really playing the game. You know, exploring is supposed to be part of the adventure in Zelda, so I didn't want to rob myself of that. I just wanted some tools to help make that more manageable. And now, thanks to Zelda Redux, I had that, and I was able to beat all of Zelda 1 for the first time, and you know what? This game is really good. I know, newsflash, one of the most controversial opinions that anyone has ever had in all of gaming. The Legend of Zelda is a good game. And this revolutionary discovery came to me a mere almost 40 years after the game originally came out. Truly, if you want the highest of high quality of video game criticism, you come to Pariah 695. But more seriously now, yeah, I quite enjoyed Zelda 1 a lot, and I was surprised to see how the many things that I'm familiar with through various later Zelda games, see how they got their beginning in the original Zelda 1, and see how things are treated a little differently, and how they're handled a little differently, but also seeing how things are very much the same as they still are to this day, Breath of the Wild not included, as that's like a totally different thing. Although honestly, coming back to Zelda 1 after playing all the other Zelda games, it makes me realize that Breath of the Wild isn't that much of a departure for the Zelda series as I originally thought. It really is kind of more of a rethinking of the original ideas that Zelda 1 was going for. Games like A Link to the Past and Ocarina of Time fleshed out the ideas of Zelda 1, but they did so in a certain way, whereas Breath of the Wild kind of undoes a lot of the history of Zelda, and in many ways goes back to Zelda 1 and kind of reinterprets those original ideas and extrapolates them in different ways. The biggest thing that stood out to me was the freedom that this game offers you, that it's not nearly as guided as every future Zelda game where they tell you where to go and what to do and which order to do the dungeons in. The game is kind of much more like a Metroidvania, where it's just the big old world and you can go wherever you want except for areas you can't access yet because you don't have the items you need. And then you're just free to roam around, explore, see what you can find, and piece things together of how you have to get through this world bit by bit. And that comes in many forms, like during my initial wandering just to try to find where the first dungeon is, I came to the Lost Woods, and there's no pomp and circumstance or explanation of what this is. I just realized in this one map screen that every direction I went, except for the one, it always just looped back into the same screen. And so I was like, okay, so this is the Lost Woods. I don't know how to get through here. I'm gonna have to figure out how to get through and come back later. So that's just a thing I can't do right now. No story, no guidance, no saying, you can't go there yet, Link, because whatever. It's just like, it's there, just like Breath of the Wild. And certainly many other Zelda games, especially the earlier ones, do still have these elements to them, but over time, as the series progresses, it gets more and more linear and more guided, to the point where we get to Skyward Sword, where the game is, like, entirely linear with almost no freedom whatsoever. But then you get Link Between Worlds, and that sort of brings back a lot of that freedom stuff, but then of course Breath of the Wild really goes back to Zelda 1 and gives you that full, free experience like the original game offered. And I knew that, you know, Breath of the Wild took a lot of inspiration from Zelda 1 and how they, like, when prototyping, they made a copy of Zelda 1 in Breath of the Wild's engine just to try stuff. And, you know, hearing all that, it's like, okay, I understand the ideas that Zelda 1 was less guided and they were trying to go back to that. But actually now playing the game, I find it fascinating to see how everything I'm familiar with in Zelda started as something that was a little bit different than how the series ended up progressing. Another thing about the exploration stuff in this game, and this really just goes for, like, Zelda in general, and it's something that I've always believed in. I mentioned how this game kind of has, like, Metroidvania elements to it, of you can't get to this area because you don't have the ladder, and you need the ladder in order to go over this gap, so that way you can get to that part of the map, and then you can keep going and get to the next dungeon or whatever. You know, that style of design that is what defines a Metroidvania, of having areas locked off by progression blockers that you need different moves or tools or abilities or whatever to get access to stuff. That whole idea we call now the Metroidvania, but, I mean, in reality, Zelda is the first game to do that kind of thing. By all accounts, Zelda is a Metroidvania, yet it predates both Metroid and Castlevania, so really, that whole genre of game should more accurately be called Zelda-likes or something like that. But I guess that term is more used for games that specifically follow the structure of Zelda, particularly in the balance between overworld and dungeons and such. So I guess that kind of works as like a subcategory, but it's weird that the game that invented this genre is a subcategory of games that were inspired by itself. I remember seeing an interview with Koji Igarashi about making Symphony of the Night, where he says that he wasn't inspired by Metroid when making that game, he was inspired by Zelda, because Zelda is a Metroidvania. Again, these elements do kind of start to fade over time from the Zelda series, but especially in the earlier games, they most definitely are Metroidvanias. Not that it really matters or whatever, who actually cares what the genre of game is called. I just always found it interesting that, like, how did that naming scheme come about? Like, Zelda is the most prominent game of this style that has this type of design. It's way bigger than either Metroid or Castlevania, yet that name got associated with those kinds of games. Maybe just because they're both 2D platformers as opposed to a top-down action-adventure game? Yeah, I don't really know. Another big point of playing Zelda 1 for the first time so many years later after being such a seasoned gamer is the dungeons in this game were very, very interesting to me as a big fan of The Binding of Isaac. I frickin' love Binding of Isaac. I have like 300 hours or something like that into Rebirth. And I've always known that Binding of Isaac is very heavily inspired by Zelda 1, but again, now actually playing Zelda 1, I'm like, oh my god, it's not just inspired by it. Binding of Isaac is just a roguelike Zelda 1. Like, that's what it is. It's just taking the dungeon gameplay of the original Zelda 1 and making that procedural and upping the challenge and stuff a lot. Because, like, everything is almost exactly the same. Not just, like, the shape of the rooms and the layouts and the looks of things, but even some of the core gameplay elements are also the same, because one thing I like about the top-down Zelda games is that their combat is very focused on movement and dodging attacks, and in Zelda 1 in particular, it almost has a little bit of like bullet hell elements to it, as the earlier Zelda games pre-Ocarina of Time were not afraid to be challenging games. I was going through some of these rooms and dealing with the enemy encounters here and going like, holy shit dude, you need like some serious dodging skills for this game. I was actually quite surprised by that. I'm playing some of these rooms and I'm like, what the fuck? You gotta do all this fucking shit to dodge all these things coming from every fucking angle all over the place. And it's like, this is genuinely really hard, actually. Not like super duper hard, it's not the hardest thing in the world, but I see how this led to the inspiration of Binding of Isaac, taking this idea and like going full on bullet hell with it. And then there's various other aspects that are kind of like double-layered interesting, because I see how they're different to future Zelda games, but how they're also like Binding of Isaac, like the keys system in this game. The fact that the keys aren't assigned to the specific dungeon, and that you can stockpile keys from an earlier dungeon and then use them in a later dungeon. That's how the whole like key thing as a valuable resource in Binding of Isaac came to be, and like even down to very, very minute stuff. Like how fires can shoot projectiles at you. I'm like, that's where that came from in Binding of Isaac? Really? And you have like the dude that asks you for the deal of like, oh, pay in money or pay in blood, and you can give him a heart container, and that kind of leads into like the deal with the devil stuff in Binding of Isaac. It was just so fascinating seeing all these things and going, I had no idea that all of these ideas were this directly taken from Zelda. And specifically Zelda 1 at that, like not even the Zelda series at large. It's all clearly, very distinctly Zelda 1. Even the HUD at the top of the screen, Binding of Isaac copied that one for one. And like Zelda has all the items and stuff that you're constantly picking up items, and you get heart containers when you beat the bosses, and there's even something you could kind of call like synergy in this game, where you get the magic rod, and then you get the magical book that increases the power of the magical rod, and so it's like, that leads into the Binding of Isaac item synergy entire focus of the game being on that kind of stuff. Seeing all these things that I am extremely familiar with in another game, and then coming back to this old-ass game and seeing how all of those ideas originated here, when a lot of those ideas were abandoned by the originating series that these ideas even came from, that was some really interesting shit, man. Anyway, talking more about the actual game now, I found the dungeons of Zelda 1 to be very interesting because of how different they are than the dungeons that we see in later Zelda games, as nowadays the dungeons that I have in my head when you say Zelda dungeons are very like specifically constructed things where you go from room to room and it slowly opens up and you fight enemies and do puzzles along the way and stuff like that. But then you come back to Zelda 1, and none of those rules were established yet. It's just a big labyrinth filled with a bunch of rooms that are filled with enemies, and you have to clear out those enemies and go from room to room and find your way to the dungeon boss and kill them and get to the end. Puzzles aren't really much of a thing in Zelda 1. They didn't implement that yet into the series, and you didn't even need to get the dungeon item a lot of times to complete them. Like, you can go into a dungeon, beat the boss, leave, and then you don't have the thing that you need to, like, access new areas, so you have to go back into the dungeon. because the idea of it being like a key progression tool for completing the dungeon wasn't there yet. Dungeons in Zelda 1 are a totally different beast than dungeons in later games. Like here, they're just kind of big collections of rooms, and honestly, I kind of really liked that. It was interesting. It was fun to just go from room to room and try to clear things out and find where I need to go and find the map and find the compass. And sometimes you would actually get lost in the dungeon, and it would feel like I don't have that kind of comfort that you have when you play a Zelda dungeon in a later Zelda game, where even if it's your first time playing the dungeon and you don't know where you're going, you always know that you're moving toward progression in some way, as long as you're getting to a new room and you do some kind of puzzle or get a key or something. But here in Zelda 1, you can walk around in circles in a bunch of different rooms, fighting all these enemies, going from room to room, and then you get to a dead end, and you didn't get anything, and you went the wrong way. Go back, and you just fought all those enemies and lost a bunch of health for nothing. And that kind of makes it feel more like a real adventure as opposed to like a video game adventure, if that makes sense. Where, you know, when you play a Zelda dungeon in a later game, every single room, it's there because it's a puzzle or, you know, it's an encounter with an enemy that you're supposed to do as part of the progression of the dungeon. Whereas here, it's not like that. The dungeon is not this big linear sequence of challenges that you have to do. It's just a big ol' area, and they say, get to the end, and you gotta figure out how to do that. And it was cool, and there were some elements of it that I found to be really intuitive and clever in a way that enabled the player to, like, be more cognizant of the dungeon than you normally would be in most Zelda dungeons. Because like I said, this game doesn't have puzzles. The closest thing it has is sometimes you have to push a block in order to make a staircase appear or something. And the thing is, in a lot of cases, there's nothing that obviously tells you that there's a block you can move here with a secret passage. But the game is so well designed that in most cases, I found it natural and intuitive to kind of just suspect that there would be a hidden passage in certain rooms, where it would be like a series of rooms that you need to fight your way through, and they're really out of the way, and you have to fight a lot of enemies to get there, and then you finally get to the final room, and it's just a dead end with nothing there, and it's like, no, this can't be it. There were too many obstacles I had to go through to get to this room. There can't possibly be nothing here. And so then you start pushing on a couple of blocks, and sure enough, there's a secret passage there. Nothing obviously told me there was a passage there, but just through my intuition of understanding that you don't put something like that in a game for no reason, I was able to figure it out. And I felt like clever, and I felt like I understood the game in a way that you don't when you just do like an obvious puzzle in a Zelda game where it's a big thing in the room that's like, look, I'm a puzzle, solve me. Rather than each individual room having puzzles you have to solve in a more obvious way, getting through the dungeon in and of itself is the puzzle here, and I thought that was really cool. And another thing it reminded me of is Dark Souls, because Dark Souls also has similar elements to that, with like finding illusory walls and stuff, where sometimes you can just tell, you can just feel it. You're going through some catacombs and there's just a very suspiciously bare wall in a room with nothing else there, and you smack that wall and yup, there's something there. You combine that with the actual genuinely decent challenge of this game and the fact that you really have to go out of your way to not be overwhelmed by enemies, and honestly, how brutal the game can sometimes be, you know, it kind of did feel reminiscent of a Souls game. And I don't mean in the like, oh, this is the Souls of Zelda games. I mean in like, you can see that Zelda was a very big influence on the Souls series. I mean, it's pretty obvious. It basically copies Z-targeting combat directly from the 3D Zelda games and fleshes it out. But, you know, I find it interesting when you look at the more specific elements and you can see how things start and how they kind of, it all stems from this game, which, you know, is not really surprising. Zelda 1 is like one of the most important video games that have ever been made. You can see how so many games over the decades have been influenced by Zelda in one way or another. And so naturally, when you come back to the original game after playing all those other games, you're gonna see the origin of all these ideas and be able to draw comparisons back to later things that have been influenced by it, and I just find that really fascinating. And I also find it very impressive. This game is genuinely really smartly designed. Like, a lot of early games, it can oftentimes feel like the people making the games didn't really know exactly what they were doing, because video games were so new and there was a lot of experimentation and testing the waters and trying to figure out what the heck a game is and how do you make it and how do they work. But you play a game like this from so long ago, and there is such a clear, deliberate understanding of everything they were doing, and there was reasoning and thought put behind everything implemented into the game. I think that's why this game stands the test of time so well, and why I was able to come back to it and finally play through the game, and why I appreciate it so much, because it's not just, you know, a very important game historically and all that. Alone, with no comparisons to anything else, it is a good game. A really good game, in fact. A very well-designed, very clever game that had a lot of really innovative ideas that were so smart and so, like, correct that they were extremely defining for the entire history of video games. It's so cool. You know, outside of RPGs, Zelda 1 was one of the first games that felt like more of a big, grandiose adventure. Like, a lot of games were very arcadey, focused on, like, individual levels and single-sitting playthroughs where a game only takes, you know, 20 to 40 minutes or something like that. But, you know, this is one of the earliest games with a save feature, and a game that you could actually really dig into and would take a lot of time to play. Like, it took me 6 hours to beat this game on my first playthrough, and for a game back then, that is unimaginably meaty. And of course, that set the stage for later games to adopt this kind of a more bigger, grandiose adventure, and getting away from the arcadey, individual level focused gameplay that you see in a lot of older games, and a lot of, you know, old school games like beat-em-ups and platformers and stuff. But also, by today's standards, Zelda 1 is a very small and tight game. Like, for an action-adventure game like this, to beat the whole thing in 6 hours, that's like a little bite-sized adventure game by modern standards, which is actually something I found pretty cool and that I appreciated about the game, that it was like a big, full, grandiose adventure, but in this tight little compact form. You know, the overworld in Zelda 1, when you really look at it, it's not that big, especially by the standards of games that came well after its time. Yet it feels big. It feels like a place that you really gotta trek through, and you gain familiarity with it, and it's just cool. You develop like a coziness with the land of Hyrule in Zelda 1, just playing through it, having no idea where these places are, but as you get further and further into the game, you get familiarity with it, and at a certain point, I didn't need the map nearly as much, and I kind of just sort of knew my way around, which was really cool. Like, also how quaint the game is. You know, this is not some big, epic, grandiose adventure. It's a game, you know? Everything here only exists to facilitate the game. There's no Master Sword. There's no big, epic, pulling the Master Sword out animation with the music playing. There's the level 1 sword, the level 2 sword, and the level 3 sword. And that's it. None of the trappings of games that we think of nowadays existed at this time. This was literally just a game, and nothing more. It's just so fascinating to me to see that a series nowadays that is treated with such reverence for every single little detail of it, back in the day, it was just like stuff in a game that existed. Koji Kondo's main theme that you hear when you're walking around the overworld, you know, I don't think that he had in mind this grandiose, epic vision of the Zelda theme that we hear nowadays. It was just like, we need some adventurous music for exploring this medieval fantasy world, and then he just whipped that up, you know? What is nowadays one of the most important series in all of gaming, back when it was being made, it was just a game that some guys were putting together. Nothing special, nothing big, nothing grandiose, nothing quote-unquote important, just a small thing being put together by a couple of people trying to make a fun time for kids. And I really enjoyed traveling back in time to Zelda's humble beginnings here and seeing what it was like before it became the juggernaut that it is now. This might sound ridiculous to some people, but honestly, playing Zelda 1 here for the first time, this is the most fun I've had on like a first playthrough of a game in quite a while. Which can sound very puzzling because, you know, games have come so far. How can a simple little primitive game like Zelda 1 be one of the most fun things I've played in a while? Well, what can I say? Generally, as a person, I kind of lean toward more old-school games than a lot of the newer stuff. I don't really care, generally, for the very, like, heavy cinematic direction of a lot of, like, modern AAA games. I'm not really into immersive sims and RPGs and stuff like that. I prefer old-school games that are generally more arcade-style, but I also like bigger adventure games as well, but kind of an older flavor, I guess I could put it. Personally, as a player of games, I'm not really that interested in immersing myself in the world of a game. When I play a game, I'm looking for a fun game, and I think that is the reason I managed to enjoy Zelda 1 so much. You know, people will say that, you know, it's a timeless classic and that it holds up, you know, it ages really well, or maybe it ages poorly. I don't know what people feel about this, but personally, I don't really subscribe to these ideas of things aging or being classics or, you know, they hold up or whatever. The reason I liked Zelda 1 so much is because it's a good game. It's a good game now, and it was a good game back then. It's always been a good game. And honestly, I would probably go as far as to say that at the time, this was probably the best video game that existed because, like, what really was out back then in the NES and arcade days that could compare to this kind of really big, epic adventure with all this really intricate, clever design in the dungeons and the overworld and everything? You know, there really was nothing that could even remotely touch Zelda at the time, I don't think. At least nothing that I can think of, but, you know, NES stuff is a little bit before my time. Generally, I kind of gravitate towards more SNES, Genesis era games, so I'm not super familiar with, like, super-duper old games. So maybe if you know other stuff that could hold a candle to Zelda from back in the day, let me know. But for my money, as far as I'm familiar with, as far as really old-school games from the 80s, I would probably say that Zelda 1 was the best video game that had ever been made at that time. However, while I have been singing this game's praises this whole time, I do have some criticisms for Zelda 1, which might feel, like, ridiculous to even bother because it's Zelda 1. Yeah, I'm really gonna criticize a game from almost 40 years ago and blah blah, but, you know, I like to look at games as games, and I'm interested in game design and stuff, and I want to critique this game like I would any other game. You know, this is the foundation that the entire Zelda series of Future was built on top of, and so if that foundation has some flaws, then, you know, it could have potentially led to an even better Zelda series if they could have been ironed out, or were ironed out in future games, or whatever. Of course, there were lots of technical limitations, and this was the early days of video games in general, so there were a lot of things that were just not understood at the time, and, you know, I'm willing to accept that and get a little bit more lenient, but if I see a problem with a game, I want to talk about it. And my first and definitely biggest problem with Zelda 1, by far, no contest, is, dear God, I have never wanted the ability to walk diagonally in a game so desperately. The fact that you can only move in cardinal directions in this game is a nightmare to put up with, because you get bombarded with really aggressive enemy patterns when you get to the later part of the game in the second quest, and there is so much shit flying at you, and I can see all these gaps in between the enemy patterns and attacks, but I can't physically go through them because my character can't fucking walk in that direction. Like, there's some tough stuff that gets thrown at you in this game, but it's nothing compared to what they throw at you in Binding of Isaac, and I can dodge shit no problem in Binding of Isaac all day, every day. But in that game, you can move diagonally, and it's a lot easier thanks to that. On top of that, not only can you not move diagonally in this game, but your movement is also limited because Link moves on a grid. While you can move in pretty much any increment of distance when moving in a single direction, if you try to change direction, then Link will snap to specific coordinates on the screen, and those are the only coordinates that he can move when transitioning a plane. Basically, in short, there is a minimum amount of distance you can move, and that's really troublesome because Like, you can see here, I'm trying to move in like a snaking pattern as tightly as possible, and this is what it looks like. And so it becomes very difficult to make just little tight maneuvers in order to avoid stuff that's getting thrown at you, because you can't make those small little adjustments. You can't weave in between things in the way that you would be able to if there was just totally free movement. And I don't really understand why the game works like this, because enemies are capable of moving diagonally and moving outside of the grid, so I don't know why the player is forced into that kind of movement. If somebody knows, please leave it in the comments. I'd be very interested to hear if there's like an actual technical reason for this or something. Because what I found while playing Zelda 1, especially when you're doing the dungeons and you're like dealing with all the enemies and then there'll be like blocks in your way, it didn't feel like, you know, a modern, quote-unquote, top-down action game where you're, you know, weaving around through everything. It felt like I was playing a really fucking hard Pac-Man game where there's all this shit and I have to move in these straight lines in order to, like, avoid everything in this, like, maze-like setup of blocks and just grid-based movement. And it was kind of fun, but it was also kind of fucking annoying, and never during my 2 playthroughs of both first and second quest did I ever stop going to myself, God, I wish I could move diagonally. My other major issue with Zelda 1 is in the enemy behavior, because it's very clear that they behave randomly. You know, they'll just randomly wander around and randomly attack in random directions at random times, and I could tell that there was probably some amount of logic to it, like every so often the game would run like an RNG check of like, should the enemy change directions or keep moving in the same direction, and probably every time it keeps moving in the same direction, the chances of it turning would increase every time until it eventually turns, something like that. And I could definitely tell that the player's proximity to the enemy would influence this stuff, because enemies tended to move toward me most of the time, especially as I got close to them, but you could still tell that their movement and behavior was random, just an influenced randomness, which I really did not like, because it made enemies completely unpredictable. You know, when you're fighting Darknuts, it's very hard to not get hit, because you have to get really close to them to hit them with your sword, and they're gonna turn and change directions and double back on themselves at random points. There's no way to tell when the enemy's gonna change direction or keep walking in the same direction they already are, and so a lot of times I would just take hits that there's really not much I could do about it. Which is not great, but I understand that back in the day, you know, at these times with this technology, AI would be very, very limited in the ability to do that, and so more procedural randomness makes sense for enemy behavior. But it did result in a lot of what felt like to me as cheap shots that I really couldn't do anything about, which would be okay if the damage in the game was relatively limited, but this game is tough, and so a lot of times when you're going through a dungeon and you have like 6 hearts and an enemy moves randomly right into you and you take damage and you lose 2 hearts, you take 1/3 of your health from random enemy behavior, which felt like it was just really frustrating and shitty feeling. You know, unfair comparison, but comparing it to Binding of Isaac, in that the enemies are much more difficult than anything in Zelda 1 in terms of their attacks and what they're capable of. But the enemies have behaviors for the most part. Very few of the enemies behave just completely randomly, and so you can comfortably predict what the enemy is going to do and understand how they're going to behave and avoid things accordingly. Whereas here, it's very unpredictable and there's really no way to know what's going to happen, and that would result in a lot of combat encounters feeling like clusterfucks of just do the best you can to take as few hits as possible, but there's no way in fuck you're not taking any damage here. It's gonna happen. Especially when fighting Wizrobes. I can already tell that these are the most infamous enemies in this game, because holy fuck, some of these rooms that are just littered with Wizrobes will fuck you up so badly. And the random movement and phasing around of the blue Wizrobes in particular was so difficult to deal with, and the randomness about when they were going to shoot their projectiles at you, oh my god, it was a fucking nightmare. Also, one other criticism for the game that's not major in any way, and I imagine a lot of people are going to disagree with me on this, I don't know if having a currency system was actually beneficial to the game. Like, what does money actually add to the game? You know, there are shops that you can go to buy things, and also it adds a bunch of, hidden secret areas you can find with a bunch of rupees, and then, you get those rupees and blah blah. Those are the positive things added to the game by the existence of rupees, but also the negative things added to the game by the existence of rupees are not having enough rupees in order to get something that you need or want, and being forced to grind in order to get that. Ideally, you would get enough money just by adventuring through the game to get what you want, but when I got toward the end of the game and I wanted to get the blue tunic and it was 250 rupees, I didn't have anywhere near that, and so my options were just wander around randomly until I get enough rupees for that, just not buy the blue tunic and just keep on going with the rest of the game without it, or grind for rupees until I have enough. And there's nothing that discourages the player from grinding. Really, it's the best choice in all situations. Like, the smartest thing to do going into every dungeon is to bring yourself a red potion, but that's gonna cost you 68 rupees every time, and you're gonna go through a lot of money trying to do that every single dungeon, and so if you really want to keep doing that, then you're inevitably gonna have to start grinding for rupees, not to mention getting the blue candle and getting the bomb carrying upgrades and stuff, plus, the blue ring as I mentioned, plus getting the magical shield, and also other stuff that you might just need to buy along the way, like bombs and stuff. Like, all of this stuff you're gonna need money for, but there's not enough money in the game to get it just by playing naturally, and so you have to resort to grinding or just not getting these things. I have every motivation to get the blue tunic as a player because it would be extremely beneficial to me, but in order to get this thing, I have to just grind for rupees for a while, which sucks and is boring. Really, this is a problem that exists in any game that has some sort of resource that you can get just by, like, killing enemies repeatedly. Personally, I loathe grinding in every game, no matter what it is, in every form. I think it is like a fundamental flaw in any game that you should really go out of your way to avoid if you can, because it always makes it so the objectively smartest thing for the player to do is to waste a bunch of their time and get bored, which is never good if you ask me. That's one of the things I like about the Zelda series in general, as opposed to a lot of other RPG series out there where, like, you don't have leveling up in Zelda. Like, heart containers, that is your level. It increases how much health you have, and it enables you to pick up the sword upgrades in this game, thus increasing your damage. So it's the equivalent of leveling up, but you can't just do it by just sitting there and killing enemies endlessly. You do it by exploring and completing challenges and doing individual, actual productive things that are usually fun to do. But then rupees do not follow that same philosophy, and instead they are exploitable in that kind of way, which I think can result in some weakness in the game if you do want to try to get everything. Although I suppose this flaw could be easily fixed by just having a greater abundance of rupees in the game that you can naturally collect by just exploring, which could have easily been done if you removed those stupid fucking secret rooms that you go into where the guy is like, "Oh, you broke the door, pay for repairs," and he just takes money from you. Like, what the fuck is that? That is just discouraging the player from trying to find secret areas and stuff. Like, that's so shitty, and there's so fucking many of those things all over the place. That was so fucking annoying. If you just removed all of those and replaced them with more secret rupee stashes, that could probably fix the problem entirely. Again, not a major issue or anything, but there was a period of like 20 minutes where I was just walking around the graveyard killing ghosts, and it was boring, and that could have just not been in the game, and that would have made the game better, if you ask me. I personally don't feel like asking the player to invest a bunch of time into something unfun is a very good thing for game design. I feel like it would be better if you just had a game where everything that the game naturally encouraged you to do by its design was enjoyable. And I know that's less a criticism for Zelda 1 in particular, and more a criticism for just, like, currency systems in games in general, But, you know, this is one of the earliest games to have something like this, and it was very influential into many future games, and many future games have the problem that started with games like Zelda 1, so I wanted to talk about it. Side note, another interesting thing about this game that I saw is how it led into future Zelda games. You know how Zelda games have the wallets and you can get like bigger wallets that let you hold more rupees? I realized playing this game that started in Zelda 1 due to technical limitations, because originally this game had a cap of 255 rupees, which I believe is the maximum number that a single bit of information can count. 256, which becomes 255 when you count 0. And so the idea of having a maximum capacity for how much money you could carry was not something that was born from, like, an actual creative idea. It was just born from a technical limitation in the original game that then turned into an idea that they had in later Zelda games, which was just really interesting to have that realization. I never thought about why the concept of wallets existed in Zelda, but now I see it, and that's just kind of cool. Again, another one of those things I appreciate, just coming back to the original Zelda and seeing how it all started. My final criticism for Zelda 1, and this is definitely going to be a very subjective thing, I did not like the second quest. I liked the first quest a lot, but the second quest to me, it felt like playing a randomizer, and I don't mean that in a good way. I generally don't really like randomizers. I only tried it once, and I thought it was just like playing the same game, but now it's a lot more tedious and boring, because now you have to run back and forth checking every single location every time you get a new item, and it kind of sucked in my experience. And second quest felt kind of like that a little bit, where you have things that are very clearly supposed to be dungeon entrances, but they're no longer dungeon entrances, and now dungeon entrances are in random locations just under a certain rock or whatever. It was kind of cool seeing the progression of the game change, where you got different items in different orders that opened up different parts of the world to you in different orders, so the exploration was a little bit different in how it was done. That was kind of cool. But also, I didn't like the dungeons generally in the second quest, because they're just really fucking long and confusing and big and elaborate, and like now suddenly there are so many fucking hidden staircases in so many rooms that have absolutely nothing indicating that there might be a hidden entrance there. Not even something that you could kind of just intuitively figure out by the layout of the dungeon. It's just like almost every room randomly has a chance of there being a secret entrance or an invisible wall that you can walk through, and so you just have to check fucking everything. But also, there are a lot of, like, traps in the layout where, like, it happened at the very end of the game, at the last dungeon, right before I got to Ganon. You have him in the top right corner room, and you have to either go up or right, and you know one of these rooms is going to be the one that leads to the final room that he's in, but you don't know which one, and so I go up into that room and see if this is the way to go. Oh no, it's not, so I have to go back the other way. Oh wait, you can't, it's a fucking one-way wall. So I take the staircase to see where that pops me out, and it spits me out all the way back at the entrance of this really fucking long-ass dungeon, and now I have to trek all the way back through to the beginning, and it's like, what the fuck is this, dude? Why would they put such a fucking bullshit layout trap like that, where there's no way for the player to know which way to go initially, and if you just don't make the correct guess, then you get punished by having to go through the whole fucking thing again? What the fuck, Tezuka? That's some bullshit right there. Or Miyamoto, whoever's responsible for that crap. And yeah, there was a lot of stuff like that in the layouts of the second quest dungeons that I really did not get on with, so I don't imagine in future I'll be doing any more second quest playthroughs of Zelda 1. But I'll definitely be coming back to Zelda 1 for the first quest. Honestly, I think I'm just gonna do another playthrough after this video, just for the fun of it, because I feel like playing it again. I want to see how much better I can do now that I actually know the layout of the game and I know where stuff is. Because I went through the entire game, first quest, without the blue tunic and without the magic shield because I didn't know where it was, and I didn't know that the magic shield was actually a thing. I saw it in the shop, and I was like, well, that just looks like the shield I already have, so maybe that's like a replacement shield if a like takes the default shield that I start with. So I never even bothered to buy the magic shield, and that made the game way fucking harder than it needed to be. And you know a game is really good when after finishing it, you immediately want to start another playthrough. Like, this was one of those games where I was really, like, into it, and I would go for, like, really long sessions playing the game all in one go, and when I wasn't playing the game, I would get excited to, like, go back and start playing the game again and pick up where I left off, and it's been quite a while since I had that kind of feeling with a game. But, you know, I guess that shouldn't really be so surprising. That's the Zelda magic there. That's why this is my favorite game series, after all. And I gotta say, after not really getting on with Zelda 1 any time in the past that I've tried to play it, now that I've finally managed to play it, and now that I know the game, I honestly would probably put this up there with, like, one of my favorite Zelda games. I don't know exactly where I would put it, but I really enjoyed it a lot. You know, minus the issues, but I was able to put up with them enough to still really like the game. I would really like to see a remake of Zelda 1, kinda Link's Awakening style, that refined it and fixed a bunch of its issues, but honestly, I don't really know if I would want Nintendo to do that, as I could very easily see them dumbing down and making the game a lot easier and simpler, like modern Zelda games are, which would be not exactly to my liking, as the, you know, elegant simplicity and the challenge of Zelda 1 is part of the things I like about Zelda 1, and it's kind of one of the things that I feel unfortunate that the series ended up abandoning over time. You know, the 2D games up until Ocarina of Time were actually, like, real games with, like, real combats that had actual, like, challenge to them. Whereas after Ocarina of Time, the whole series became, like, ridiculously baby easy, and in doing that, they did become more accessible, but they also kind of left at the doorstep some of this fun gameplay that you get with all this dodging and stuff you have to do in combat and stuff, and it's like, damn. Zelda 1 was onto something. This was a good game. And in a way, it almost kinda does now feel to me like maybe Zelda did end up going on slightly the wrong path over time. Not that I dislike the later Zelda games by any means, I still love them, I think they're awesome games, but it was just interesting coming back to Zelda 1 and seeing how different it was and going, you know, what this game was doing, the stuff that eventually ended up getting abandoned in the series over time, I kinda wish they didn't abandon some of these ideas. So yeah, Zelda 1, as it turns out, really good game. I would recommend it. I know, controversial opinions all over the place right here. Thank you for watching, hope you enjoyed. I'll see you next time.